this $50 billion funding under the newly declared national emergency.
Rémi Bourget, we're talking about this emergency package. Let's focus a shift just temporarily, if we can, to Europe. Of course, the monetary policy didn't manage to calm the markets yesterday. Moving away from Trump, we'll come back to him in a moment. Would it be accurate to say that Christine Lagarde, the president of the European Central Bank, potentially undersold her role in this crisis? Because we are seeing this global issue with the economy, more specifically in Europe, where we are right now.
Well, she clearly has limited room for maneuver, really, in terms of conventional moves. Interest rates are already negative, and there was expectations she would concentrate interest rates further into negative territory. She didn't do that, but also she really wanted to make the governments feel more responsible for the economic response, and there's clear lack of coordination among European governments on the economic front. Of course, her performance, Christine Lagarde's performance, was quite poor when she said that, in a sense, spreads among European sovereign debts are none of her business. So that was quite a surprising statement for sure.
And plenty of peculiar statements that we're hearing. Earlier, Donald Trump saying that aggressive action will be taken against China. And this is something that's been very much circulating. Some on the extreme end of the spectrum saying that China should essentially pay for some damages, Donald Trump being amongst them, for its negligence, because obviously that Wuhan, the province, is the epicenter of that outbreak of coronavirus.
Well, none of that is ever going to happen, of course. In the end, it's really in the hands of every national government to really tackle this crisis. And there's a lack of coordination generally, whether in Europe or among governments globally, and have very different approaches, both on the health side, also, of course, on the economic front. And that's really what's really lacking is this coordination to address the economic cost and the financial consequences. I mean, we are in the middle of a huge financial crash with stock indices collapsing day after day, and with a very limited rebound today. So clearly, it's also how the personal equation of Donald Trump has changed dramatically over the past few days with this financial crash, and he understands his chances to be re-elected have changed dramatically.
And that's what I want to talk to Armin about now. Armin, we've seen this shift in position. We heard from even Deborah Burke speaking alongside Donald Trump, saying that the president has finally taken charge. Too little, too late ahead of the presidential election?
Well, I think we heard a very kind of election-y undertone, even in this, as I said, quite sober set of remarks. I mean, most of the first few minutes, Trump was talking about how things would be even worse if he hadn't taken aggressive measures at the start. Well, how do you prove that? I mean, obviously you can't prove something that didn't happen, but, he was saying essentially because we stopped, people coming from China early on, this would be a lot worse. I mean, who knows? But I think he was kind of, again, there was echoes of his election rallies there, when he was saying how US had been very prompt and when other countries, when some of his own public health officials had said, no, don't close borders, he actually went further than the advice he was given. At least that's what he's been claiming in his rallies. And I think we heard echoes of that now. Who knows what's going to happen going forward? And I mean, obviously, we'll have to see if these rallies, which are so important to his campaign, he loves campaigning with very large groups of people, will that still be able to go ahead or not? I think he's kind of gone down a different track now. He's clearly now surrounding just the sight of these, this press conference with these public health officials around him. That I think after this image, it's going to be pretty hard for him just to go off on a complete limb of his own and just say, okay, fine, let's gather, let's really concentrate people.
You never know, it's Donald Trump. Unpredictable has proven to be.
You never know.
Now, I want to shift the focus back and bring you in, if I can, Rémi Bourget. We've been speaking about the various measures that the US administration's finally taken, announced by Donald Trump. One of them is, of course, that travel ban on European nationals. A lot of confusion and criticism here on the continent. Something else that we're seeing, something that you and I touched upon earlier, was this impact that this crisis has had on the global economy. How can it be rebooted at this stage?
Well, it can't really. I mean, we're really in the middle of this crisis, and governments are taking very limited action so far on the
Is that
economic
enough?
front.
50 billion US dollars. He mentioned the Europe, I believe, 37 billion euros. It's still a tiny percentage of the GDP.
Well, those sums are, I think, really targeting health needs. I mean, really for the health system. Has nothing to do with any kind of economic
So
stimulus.
we're not taking
very
into
far
account
from
when
that.
we mentioned this budget, for example, Emmanuel Macron, the French president, saying yesterday in his address that the workers will be compensated 99% of them as a result of what they lose out because of this crisis?
Well, that's significant. It's really a way to avoid really a collapse in demand following all the already the impact on companies. But really, there's really nothing at this time going in the direction of any massive stimulus. But in a sense, well, there are positive developments. Governments being aware, really, they have to avoid any major disruption in terms of supply chains and demand as much as they can, but there's nothing really massive and coordinated really to reboot the economy either at a national or more international level so far.
Armin Georgian?
Well, I mean, yeah, it's true. Remy is right. This was only addressing public health needs. So yeah, I think it is clearly falling short of the kind of measures that have been announced by the French government. But you also have to remember that proportionally, it's a much bigger problem in France because you've got a lot more cases. We heard from the French health minister earlier this evening. There's been 1,000 more cases since last night.
Second highest number of cases in Europe after Italy.
Yeah. So you would expect, whereas in America, it's 1,700 cases, but in a much bigger population. So we should still keep it in perspective, I suppose.
And how are we feeling about the measures we're seeing imposed here in France?
Well, I mean, I think we're waiting to see if we do go to an Italian-style situation, which would be much more serious in terms of public transport lockdowns. And in Italy at the moment, of course, you've got people needing a special health certificate if they want to leave one region and travel to another. So that's a whole other level.
Being fined if they don't, sentenced to 3 months in prison.
Exactly. So at the moment, I think life, although yes, in France there have been this scrambles at supermarkets, which are familiar now across Europe, but we haven't reached this point of restaurants being closed, and it's not a complete lockdown situation. But as I said, a very, very rapidly deteriorating situation here in terms of the cases just in 48 hours. So who knows in the next few days.
I mean, Bourgeois, are you stocking up on your food and toilet paper?
No, not really, but I'm still very concerned. I mean, there's the health crisis in itself, of course, the economic consequences, and all this is happening against a very imbalanced background globally on the financial front, with these massive asset bubbles which are bursting at the moment and massive debt loads, I mean, at most companies worldwide. So for example, Italy is worst hit by the epidemic at this time, and it's a country who's
because of the already failing economy. And also in France, I think there is cause for concern because we've had a series of issues. We had the Gilets jaunes, the Yellow Vest movement, followed by the unprecedented strikes, and now this.
Yeah, the main really concern right now is how it could become a systemic economic crisis with failing companies unable to repay their debts, and then failing banks, and that would really restart the worst concerns in Europe about a new euro crisis. So that's really something that can happen, and there's no tool really that has been implemented over the past few years to really address anything like that. And in the end, every government is really sort of alone to address those economic and financial systemic consequences. And at some point, we'll see government having to really step in terms of bailouts of companies.
What would that mean in
banks.
terms of a budget, a massive bailout? What you're speaking about right
Well,
now, is that
it depends
feasible?
on the magnitude of the crisis, but that can be absolutely huge, and that's when we have to see central banks also step in with even more unconventional measure, perhaps, than QE. Quantitative easing has been presented as something of a magic tool since 2009.
If you can tell our viewers what that means
But that was quite
exactly.
inefficient. That has really inflated bubbles that are now just bursting. That was not a very profound recovery either in the US or, of course, even less so in Europe. So we could see really bailouts of an incredible magnitude with some support of central banks. It could be they could use some innovation that have been discussed in terms of digital currency. We see cryptocurrency collapsing at the moment. Central bank digital currencies are something really different. It's really central bank money, and central banks could get more involved really to inject money in a much more in a massive way, but in a more targeted way to really help those companies and to avoid a systemic crisis really building up and exploding in the coming month.
Camille Bourgeois, thank you so much, economist, for being with us here on France 24 and for that very insightful analysis. As always, Armand Georgian, thank you for being with us to talk through that address by Donald Trump. Thank you for watching. Do stay tuned. More news coming up with me and the team in just under 4 minutes' time. Thank you.